Right now, as you're watching this video, work's still going on in Egypt on the new Delta Mega Project, the largest agricultural project in Egyptian history. The plan is for an artificial river 71 miles long to generate 2.6 billion gallons of water, and not just anywhere, but right in the world's largest, hottest desert. Yep, a river in the middle of the Sahara. But why are they doing that? The answer might surprise you, but first I'll make myself a coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do something under the video in case you forget. Back in February 2020, Egypt reached an important milestone. The country's 100 millionth citizen was born. Actually, it was a girl, as the new citizen was named Yasmin Rabi. Yasmin was born in a village in the Minya Governorate. And this event was noted in Cairo by a giant counter next to the country's National Statistics Agency. Hitting the 100 million mark is certainly a sign of abundance, but in Egypt's case, it also sparks some serious worries. Let me explain why. 100 years ago, Egypt's population was just 13.6 million people. That means in just 1 century, it grew almost tenfold. Just imagine. On top of the number of people already living there, you've got a whole new population the size of modern Germany, or, say, Turkey. By October 1st, 2022, Egypt's population had reached 104 million, which means a growth of 1 million in 245 days, or 8 months and 5 days. That's very, very fast. As of when this video was made, the population of Egypt is already estimated at 117 million. Let's assume we trust the statistic, and that means an increase of 13 million. This is the population of, say, Guinea or 2 Serbias. Thanks to its rapidly growing population, Egypt ranks among the 20 most populated countries in the world and is the most populated country in the entire Arab world. It also doesn't seem like the population growth will slow down in the future. Experts forecast that by 2030, the population might hit 128 million. According to other estimates, by 2050, Egypt's population will reach 162 million. However, local officials view all this population growth as a problem. And a pretty big one. So big, in fact, that they're in a state of high alert when it comes to fighting the population increase. For example, public health campaigns called 2 is Enough have already been launched to persuade parents to have fewer children. But it's not only about the number of people. The demographic crisis in Egypt is worsened by its harsh geographical location. 95% of the population lives on about 4% of the land, which is a green belt about half the size of Ireland. This belt runs along the Nile, then branches out into the lush delta of the river. The rest of the country is a harsh, totally uninhabitable desert. But it's not just uninhabitable. What's worse is you can't grow food there. Only 4% of Egypt's land is suitable for farming, and this percentage is actually shrinking, and pretty quickly too. The reason is urban and suburban development, which happens alongside population growth, and as the cities expand, they swallow up the few fertile lands there are. Experts agree that this is a real crisis. Satellite data shows that Egypt is losing about 2% of its arable land every decade due to urbanization, and this process is speeding up. For example, the amount of land around Alexandria set aside for farming decreased by 11% from 1987 to 2019, while urban areas increased by that same 11%. About 15% of Egypt's most fertile farmland has been damaged by rising sea levels and the infiltration of salt water. Obviously, once this happens, the land becomes useless for growing anything. And if this continues, Egypt will face serious food security problems. The population's growing and feeding it's getting harder. Meanwhile, the country has not just one, but several deserts. Among them, the Arabian Desert and the Sahara Desert are the largest, while the rest are smaller deserts located within the territory of the first 2. But the Sahara is by far the biggest. It covers almost the entire country of Egypt. And if Egypt's population really reaches 162 million by 2050, as experts predict, it means the country will have to figure out how to feed nearly 50 million new hungry mouths. Obviously, the desert won't provide any food. What about imports? With limited arable land and water resources, Egypt simply can't become self-sufficient in producing many products. For example, grains, vegetable oil, and animal proteins. It's no surprise that 40% of Egypt's imports are food and agricultural products. The country has been and remains one of the largest wheat importers in the world. For example, from July 2018 to June 2019, the import was estimated at 12.5 million metric tons. The corn import during the same period was 9.3 million tons. Besides these two crops, they also import soybeans, beef and its products, animal feed, dairy products, and cotton, though it's not related to food. Egypt's population keeps growing, and the country still relies on imports to meet more than 50% of its food and agricultural needs. Just in case, I'll repeat the numbers. 50% of Egypt's food is imported, and food makes up 40% of all imports. Got it? Then let's move on. It's no secret that some of the biggest wheat suppliers are Ukraine and Russia. Together, they account for almost a third of all wheat sold in the world. But in recent years, shipments have stopped. This has shaken the global wheat market and caused prices to rise by over 50%. Naturally, this price hike has impacted the economic situation in Egypt. 85% of its wheat used to come from these two countries. Of course, the current situation would be worrying for any country, and especially for Egypt. Partly, this is due to the unique relationship Egyptians have with bread. Bread is a cheap product that's a basic necessity for the population, so much so that most Egyptians eat bread 3 times a day. The culture of the country is such that having a meal without bread is considered incomplete. Many countries have similar foods that are essential to their way of life. In a sense, removing bread from Egypt would be like removing rice from China. Overall, it's really serious and is causing concern among Egyptians, highlighting Egypt's food vulnerability once again. And something needs to be done about this vulnerability. Arable land is shrinking, imports are shaking up the country, and the population is growing. One of the solutions to these challenges has been the effort to reclaim and green parts of the desert. This has been ongoing for several decades, and over time, large areas of desert have been successfully transformed into agricultural land. Satellite images show new farming areas and a few new cities along the Cairo Highway. This was made possible through a combination of centralized and drip irrigation relying on groundwater. While small-scale agriculture for local consumption is common in the main part of the delta, most farmers on the desert's edge grow grains, fruits, and vegetables. Some of this produce is even exported. While it's possible to create new farmland in the desert by tapping into groundwater resources, the process is highly complex, resource-intensive, and extremely costly. Moreover, desert soils, even when irrigated, are a poor substitute for the rich, fertile soils of a river delta. Also, there's one thing about this. After being used as farmland for a while, a large portion of these newly developed areas has been abandoned and is now reverting to desert. Overall, the situation is complex, and it's clear that all the efforts made so far are not enough to sustain the rapidly growing population. And now the grand project New Delta enters the stage, the one we mentioned at the start of the video. This ambitious initiative aims to cultivate over 2.2 million fedans of desert land. 1 fedan equals 45,000 square feet. To make this vision a reality, an artificial river will be created. It'll include 14 miles of underground pipes that'll carry groundwater, agricultural runoff, and drainage water after being treated at the Al Hammam station. On top of that, they're planning to create 57 miles of regular open river. And yes, this is one massive project. It'll be located west of the Nile Delta in Lower Egypt, and it'll be part of the government's plans to establish new agricultural and urban communities. You could say it's the next, much more advanced step after simple irrigation, which will also provide jobs for over 5 million people. An artificial river stretching 71 miles is expected to produce around 2.6 billion gallons of water, which should be enough to provide the necessary food supply for Egypt's growing population. This is specifically handled by the Egypt's Future Project, part of the New Delta Initiative. This sub-project aims to create 15% more farmland. According to government officials, 3 canals will be created for this, and together they'll form an artificial river. The first channel of the artificial river will be 26 miles long and carry 2.6 billion gallons of water. This will allow irrigation of about 600,000 acres. On top of that, the second channel, stretching 106 miles, will provide irrigation for another 800,000 acres. And finally, the third channel, 7.5 miles long, will reclaim 64,000 acres of land from the desert for irrigation. That's massive. The initiative has been marked by the Egyptian government as a top national security priority, and it also includes plans to develop new cities along the banks of an artificial river. It's been calculated that the whole thing will cost $5.8 billion, which is much higher than the original estimate of $3.1 billion. That's the amount the project was valued at when it was first announced in 2021. What about the land? It's already been allocated, covering 30 acres along the highway between Rad El Farag and the Al Dabaa area. It's a convenient spot, close to the ports and markets with access to the labor force from nearby villages. But wait, where's all this water going to come from? They thought about that too. Considering that the groundwater reserves in Egypt reach 650 billion gallons a year, the Ministry of Irrigation decided to mix agricultural drainage water, cleaned at the station, with groundwater to prevent the depletion of aquifers due to overuse. Now that's a practical approach that everyone should adopt, because it looks like Egypt really got well prepared. So to speak, they did their homework before starting the project. For example, soil studies and analysis were carried out, which showed that over 90% of the allocated land is suitable for strategic crops that Egypt mostly imports. As I mentioned earlier, these include wheat, corn, soybeans, grains, also potatoes, vegetables, and various fruits. Moreover, it seems that Egypt is now planning to grow crops here in surplus, so there will be enough to even export some. As for the money, over 35 private companies are already involved through rental agreements or partnerships. These companies handle over 90% of the related infrastructure construction, road paving, drilling, pipe laying, and land reclamation. However, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi pointed out that handling such a large area, equivalent to the size of 3 major states, should be done by the government. In fact, it makes a lot of sense because this requires very large-scale and centralized planning across several sectors. No one but the government can take on such responsibility. The New Delta project is expected to be completed in 3 stages. The first stage will focus on developing infrastructure for the project, including roads, canals, and irrigation systems. The second stage will involve building dams and reservoirs to store water for irrigation, and the third will be the actual land cultivation. But actually, this project isn't the only one like it. In the Sahara, they've already tried creating a river before. Back then, the project was called the New Valley Project. It started in 1997 and involved building a system of canals to transport water from Lake Nasser to irrigate part of the sandy wastelands of the Western Desert, which is part of the Sahara. Back in 1997, the Egyptian government decided to develop a new valley and focus on creating agricultural and industrial communities. It was an ambitious project aimed at helping Egypt cope with its rapidly growing population. Unfortunately, the project stalled at that time, but now the president has decided to give it special attention. Let's see where this leads, but for now, let's return to the New Delta. The project started not long ago, but it's already faced some technical problems that have led some experts to claim that the New Delta is unfeasible. The main issue is the sand. It poses a threat to agricultural, government, and private properties, disrupts the roads, and separates villages from one another. To solve this problem, they need programs to stabilize the sand dunes. This can be done in 2 ways, either mechanically, by adding rocky materials that reduce the area exposed to wind erosion, or by using biological control. In other words, plants can be planted there to fix the dunes in place. Because if they don't do that, the wind from the Sahara will constantly blow a huge amount of sand straight into the newly created river. And the buildup of sand in open channels and water pathways limits the flow of water to agricultural lands and reduces its volume. A 2017 study reveals that sand dunes are a serious barrier to making any project work, whether for farming or industry. So it turns out that it's not enough to just dig canals and build irrigation systems. You also have to constantly fight the desert, and if you don't do that, all your efforts will be in vain and the money will be wasted. By the way, Egypt doesn't really have enough money. Because of this, the New Delta project has been criticized by many Egyptians. The main point of concern is whether it's the right time to start such a huge project when the country's finances are anything but stable. However, the project seems to have more pros than cons. Aside from everything I've already mentioned, the New Delta should solve the problem of the water shortage in the Nile. It all started when Ethiopia decided to build a dam on the Nile River to generate electricity for its population. The goal seemed good, everyone does that, but Ethiopia is upstream from Egypt, and for the dam to work, a reservoir is needed. Filling it requires reducing the flow of the Nile for a couple of years, and the countries downstream aren't happy about it. Less water in the Nile means less water for the population, which is already struggling with shortages. Just so you understand, 90% of Egypt's population depends on the Nile, and it's a matter of survival. However, Ethiopia ignored outside protests, filled the reservoir, violated a couple of old water agreements, but now the situation seems to have normalized. Just recently, the fourth and final phase of filling the reservoir was completed. This happened on September 10, 2023, though the countries almost went to war over the dam. I'm saying this because if the new Delta project is fully implemented, it'll protect Egypt from the consequences of such decisions made by their Nile neighbors. After all, independence is a plus. The most important news from the past few days is that I got my tooth fixed. Record-breaking plant. Along with construction in the Nile Delta, a one-of-a-kind facility has been launched in Egypt, the largest wastewater treatment and recycling station in the world for agricultural purposes. The project was executed by a group of companies commissioned by the country's Ministry of Defense, and you know what? The project was so grand that it set 4 records, all of which were officially registered in the Guinness World Records. But first, let's take a closer look at the facility. The wastewater treatment plant, with a production capacity of 2 billion gallons, plays a key role in irrigating more than 1 million acres of land west of the Nile Delta. The project is also aimed at tackling pollution in the Lake Mariu area and the coastal zones of Alexandria, while simultaneously boosting agriculture and overall well-being. Additionally, the plant helps with climate change adaptation by preventing flooding in the Bahira Governorate, channeling excess water into the new Delta creation area. During rainy seasons and floods, this project can reduce the demand for water from the high dam as the excess water is disposed of. Now let's get to the records. First, this plant is the largest water treatment facility in the world, covering an area of 79 acres. Second, the plant stands out with its unique capacity of 23,000 gallons per second. Third, the factory features a record-breaking epoxy coating covering 128 acres. And finally, the last record, the plant's sludge treatment unit has an impressive performance of 1,477 pounds. Egyptians really know how to impress. Soilless farming. Despite all the water treatment plants and desalination efforts, Egypt still suffers from a shortage of this resource. As you can already tell, this leads to another problem: a reduction in arable land. Less than 4% of Egypt's land is suitable for farming, and that number keeps dropping. Something needed to be done about this, and Egyptian farmers came up with a solution. They're increasingly turning to soilless farming technologies. We're talking about hydroponics, which means growing plants in water rich in nutrients inside greenhouses with precise climate control. Materials like sand, gravel, clay, as well as foam or sponges are used as support for the plant's roots. In some hydroponic systems, even animal waste is used as fertilizer. But honestly, that's not really a new thing. It's something that's been practiced a lot on farms for a long time. Hold on a second. I just mentioned that Egypt has a water shortage, and now we're talking about hydroponics, which can't work without water? Well, according to a 2020 report from the World Wildlife Fund, hydroponics uses just 10% of the water that traditional farming does. On top of that, this method helps cut down on deforestation and reduces pesticide use. In summary, soil-free farming could be a game changer for areas dealing with water scarcity. And I almost forgot to mention another advantage of hydroponics. It helps save a lot by reducing the need for fertilizers by as much as 60%. And this is literally a lifesaver for farmers because the cost of fertilizers has increased significantly in recent years. Sharing the Nile. Just recently, in the fall of 2024, a group of 10 countries located in the Nile Basin announced an agreement on the equitable use of water resources. Egypt opposed this, and so did Sudan, because essentially they'd been operating under the 1929 agreement, a very convenient agreement made between Egypt and Great Britain. It gave Egypt and Sudan rights to the Nile's water, with Egypt receiving 14.5 trillion gallons out of a total of 22 trillion gallons, and Sudan getting 5 trillion gallons. The interests of the other countries were not taken into account. Yeah, that's exactly the agreement that Ethiopia ignored when it built its dam. Several East African countries have now decided to ratify the agreement aimed at jointly managing the Nile's resources. Ethiopia, Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi have already ratified the document. Egypt and Sudan, as I mentioned earlier, have refused to sign it. Congo's also abstained, and Kenya has yet to submit its ratification documents to the African Union. The agreement is meant to ensure joint and sustainable management of the river, which is a vital resource for all the bordering countries. Naturally, Egypt and Sudan are just afraid of losing their share of the Nile water because they don't have enough as it is. But the truth is, no one has enough, so it's hard to say who's right and who's to blame in this situation. Let's see how things play out with this new agreement. There's never too much desalination. It's likely that concerns over the potential division of Nile water are driving Egypt's plans to significantly boost its production of fresh water through desalination. The country's sovereign fund will give private companies concessions to build 17 new plants over the next 5 years, all powered by solar panels. According to the plans, the new plant should produce up to 740 million gallons of fresh water per day, with the potential to double that amount in the future. Currently, Egypt has desalination capacity that can provide about 211 million gallons per day. If everything goes well with the construction, Egypt will increase this figure to 1.7 billion gallons by 2050. Sounds impressive. And if you think it'll be hard to find money for all these plants, the situation's actually the opposite. Investors are actively interested in desalination units and are even proposing plans to triple the planned capacity. Carm Solar, a local solar energy producer and utility provider, has also announced its intention to participate in the tender for part of the project. The company proposes to cut costs by using solar power to provide electricity, water, and other services rather than just offering one. In short, if everything goes as planned, Egypt will no longer have water shortages. You owe me an unobtrusive like. See you later.